Stefan,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks a lot.
I am, as the media regularly say, a repatriationist. The Allies stood by while 17.5 million German citizens were thrown out of their homes, out of their villages, out of their towns, off their farms, and sent westwards from provinces that they had lived in for 900 to 1,000 years, and the Allies said nothing. So the precedent has been set within living memory to repatriate people who do not belong in Europe at all. They have no right to be here, they didn't ask, they weren't invited, and that's always going to be my position until they lock me up in a box.
Refugees, anti-communists were sent back to Russia to be killed by Stalin, about 3 million.
That's a different issue. We were now to hear from Konrad Szymanski, who came over a few days ago from the Polish Parliament to speak to us on the situation in Poland and touching on Hungary, outposts against the liberal fascism that we are experiencing here in ridiculous concepts such as gender and other matters. And unfortunately, this morning he broke his leg and is now at the hospital. So he's not going to make an appearance after coming all this way. So I'm going to speak to you about the current climate of fear that Stefan was talking about, and its history, because in fact its history goes back quite a long way, and it's nearly all at the hands of the Labour Party. If we go back to 1965, the Labour Party drafted the Race Relations Act of 1965, outlawing apparent discrimination on the grounds of colour, race, or allied and alien ethnic or national origins in all public places in Great Britain. The following year, the Race Relations Board was created to consider complaints under the Act. 3 years later, Labour again brought in the Race Relations Act to amend the 1965 Act, which made it illegal to refuse housing, employment, public services to a person on the grounds of colour, race, alien, ethnic, or national origins. It also created the Community Relations Commission to promote harmonious community relations. The Act was criticised for poorly translating new standards of behaviour into an effective legal document. The Act was the focus of Enoch Powell's so-called Rivers of Blood speech, delivered to the West Midlands Conservative Association on the 20th of April 1968. Powell was then sacked by Ted Heath the following day from his position in the shadow cabinet. This legislation and Heath's subsequent action were possibly the first high-level demonstrations that criticism of alien immigration would not be tolerated at Westminster by so-called democratic representatives. Labour came along again in 1976 with a new Race Relations Act, incorporating the previous two and with numerous other oppressive features against the rights of the free indigenous peoples of these islands. It also established the notorious Commission for Racial Equality to constantly review the legislation and to make sure the Act rules were legally complied with. The Act was later amended, again by Labour, in 2000 in their Race Relations Amendment Act, which notably imposed a statutory duty on all public bodies to promote mythical, that wasn't in the Act, racial equality, and to demonstrate that procedures to prevent race discrimination were in place. Now you can see this is quite a while ago. That's in the last century. Not to be outdone by all this dogmatic socialist legislation and Marxist deconstruction of facts, the fake conservatives decided that they would introduce the 1986 Public Order Act, the first to actually define racial hatred. I mean, I'd never heard of racial hatred when I was growing up, so this was all fairly new to me. This was a far-reaching act, clearly aimed at the indigenous population of the UK. After all, who else was it aimed at? It covered literature, broadcasting, theatre, film, and advertising. It also gave a definition to racially inflammatory material, which was all-embracing, and gave the police wide powers of entry into people's property and entry and search, and provided for orders of forfeiture. Now, it's worth keeping all this in perspective here, as we are not talking about murderers, child molesters, violence, but people's personal opinions. Just over a decade later, in 1998, the far-left Runnymede Trust published a report by Bhikkhu Parekh, a socialist Indian from Gujarat, calling for a new Equality Act, which would consolidate and advance the existing legislation. New Labour took on board the report in 2004 and legislated the Equality Act 2006, creating the Equality and Human Rights Commission, merging the Commission for Racial Equality, the Equal Opportunities Commission, and the Disability Rights Commission. Outlawing of discrimination on goods, on services, on the grounds of religion and belief, subject to exemptions, and allowing the government to introduce regulations outlawing discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation in goods and services, which also led to the Sexual Orientations Act of 2006. You'd be wondering where your personal opinions now lie, because they're covering everything. They have created a public duty to promote equality on the grounds of gender. After the bill was reintroduced, further lobbying by the Guyanan and openly homosexual Muslim Wahid Ali, one of Blair's cronies, succeeded in forcing the government to add homophobic discrimination to this bill. Both Parekh and Ali were duly elevated to the House of Lords by Labour. 1998 was also a special year for even more oppressive socialist legislation, obviously targeting the indigenous population again, in the Crime and Disorder Act. Despite the simplistic title, its main contentious sections were on racially aggravated offences in England and Wales. The definition of what constitutes the meaning of this may shock you. An offence is racially aggravated if, at the time, or immediately before or after, the offender demonstrates towards the victim of the offence hostility based on the victim's membership of a racial group, or the offence is motivated by hostility towards members of a racial group based on their membership of that group. A subsection states, membership in relation to a racial group includes association with members of that group. And presumed means presumed by the offender. Defining racial group means a group of persons defined by reference to race, color, nationality, including citizenship, or ethnic or national origins. You can see here how amazingly all-embracing this legislation actually is. However, it continues. In 2003, Labour, again, introduced the Communications Act of 2003. The Act had a large number of provisions, including the following. Sending a malicious communication using social media was made a criminal offence. Section 127 of the Act makes it an offence to send a message that is grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene, or menacing character over a public communications network. This section has been used controversially to prosecute users of social media. It was declared an offence to persistently make use of public electronic communications network for the purpose of causing annoyance, inconvenience, or needless anxiety. The public service remit for the delightful Channel 4 was revised, and broadcasters were required to carry a suitable quantity and range of programs dealing with religion and other beliefs as part of their public service broadcasting. The Broadcast Committee of Advertising Practice was established as the regulatory body ensuring that advertising on radio and television is not misleading. Well, you could have fooled me watching the ads. Harmful or offensive or beyond the boundaries of taste and decency. Well, ads full of aliens and nobody else, when they make up less than 10% of the population, for me, is pretty offensive. Let us now go to North Britain, where even more scandalous legislation has been introduced by the far-left Scottish National Party, virtually without opposition. Yet they had less than half of the national vote at all elections. In 2010, the SNP passed the even more innocuously named Criminal Justice and Licensing Act. I looked right through this. I couldn't see any particular mentions of licensing. Section 38 deals with threatening and abusive behavior, which behavior would be likely to cause a reasonable person to suffer fear or alarm, and intends by the behavior to cause fear or alarm, or is reckless as to whether the behavior would cause fear or alarm. So that's catch-all, because if the sheriff decides that your behavior has been reckless, then you're sunk. But that's not all. It goes on to a subsection which states, this applies to behavior of any kind, including, in particular, things said or otherwise communicated, as well as things done, which behavior includes a course of conduct. So you could be in an argument or an online debate, Facebook or something, and you'd be caught under this legislation, because they'd just cherry-pick everything you'd said, and they'd say, well, look at this fellow's obviously a raving extremist, we're going to nab him. So what has been happening in Scotland is that the prosecutors have been using this all-embracing Section 38 in concert with Labour's UK Crime and Disorder Act of 1998, which is about race, which is not what the latter act was intended for, because the SNP's act came in 12 years later, but they are now putting the two together to prosecute people. So it's impossible when you have two all-embracing pieces of legislation that you can escape if you have been targeted by the police or by some nutcase. It's just not at all impossible. In addition, in 2015, the SNP introduced legislation forbidding the right to appeal, something most people think is automatic in all free societies. You can lodge a brief application, an application to appeal against, say, a single sheriff's verdict, but it then goes to the Sheriff Appeal Court, which is in fact a couple of officers staffed by other sheriffs. These nice chaps are clearly always going to support their colleague, especially if they're on the same political wavelength. So your application will almost certainly be refused. So there's no way that you're going to be permitted an appeal. These pieces of legislation are, in fact, part of the road to a totalitarian state. I once had the occasion to speak to someone who had been apprehended in the street by the police, who said, "We're going to charge you with X." The chap said, "That's complete rubbish and does not apply to me." The two policemen then said to him, "Well, look, don't worry, there are lots of other catch-alls we can use. I.e., we're going to get you. So it doesn't really matter if you don't like this particular accusation that we're leveling against you, we can easily come up with something else." We have, ladies and gentlemen, in my view, entered a new dark age in Britain, where the left have infiltrated even the judiciary to such an extent that freedom of expression is as meaningless as the fake justice they're handing down. Thank you very much. Questions? Yes, Michelle.
Do we have any idea who are the actors behind this legislation?
Well, it's always the left. The SNP, they're really far left. Individuals? No, I can't. I can tell you that the first, the fellow that drafted the Race Relations Act of 1965 was an immigrant. So, yes, Andrew.
You rightly condemn the Labour Party, but let none of us think that the Conservatives are any better. They've gone along with this without the courage to oppose it, and therefore they're complicit with it.
Well, that is correct. That's absolutely correct, because we, real conservatives, are opposed to oppression of our freedom of expression and freedom of speech. If someone comes up to me and says, "I don't like you, you're an XYZ," I just accept it. You know, you know, people, when I was growing up, we used to say, "Oh, the French, they're the old enemy," you know. Well, technically, I suppose you can't say these things now. And of course, everyone went around saying, "Oh, Germans, oh, no, they're all Nazis." You know, apart from that being completely idiotic. It's just, this is the way we've always talked. We've always talked about groups of people, Protestants, Catholics. When I was at good Church of England school, they used to say, "You know, so-and-so over there, it's a Catholic." You know, well now that'd be sunk under these pieces of legislation. And so all these pieces of legislation have come together. They've come together so that if they target you, if the authorities target you, or just some member of the left targets you, they'll have you. They'll go down to the police station, they'll say, Joe Bloggs, he's saying offensive things about Indians. And the police will act. And they'll get out all this legislation, and you haven't got a hope. And if you're in Scotland, you haven't any hope at all, because they won't let you appeal it. They refuse to allow you to appeal the judgment of a single sheriff, which is where these cases are heard. One person's judgment cannot be questioned. Now, that's not what we understand as the British way of life and British justice. That's not justice. Any more questions? Yes.
It seems to me that as British people, we have gone through a process of becoming less confident about who we are. But if you agree with that, if you do, could you offer some explanation about that? During, say, from the First
Well,
World
I think a lot of this dates back to 1945 and the disservice that Hitler and his crew did to all of us. Because they promoted nationality, they promoted Europeans and so on. But a lot of these things, there shouldn't be anything wrong with continuing to promote this, as long as it doesn't lead to genocide and lunacy on a vast scale. We should be proud of being British. We have a great heritage. We have a great history. We colonized the world. We took our engineering all over the world. In India, they have the largest railway network in the world, built by us. All the communications, all the water supplies, all the roads, everything, all the harbors, the hydroelectric, electricity was all done by us. Yeah. And when we went to Africa, we did much the same thing, and we educated, unlike, say, the Portuguese who had colonies there for God knows how many centuries, we educated the locals. We had proper education systems in all our colonies for the natives. So there's absolutely no reason that we should not have this great legacy of greatness. We are great, and we should be proud of who we are. And I think it's a scandal that we have this element in society now that is constantly putting that down and saying we're going to decolonize the curriculum and we're going to do. These people are British haters, in my view. They are not patriots. And I think there's, every country should be proud of their vast achievements. Even Germany, notwithstanding the Nazis, but Germany, what they have produced, scientists, people like Robert Koch, and all these great geniuses. And every country should be proud of those parts of their heritage that are worth bragging about and singing out about, and that includes us.
I would say that also our heritage goes on top of in Australia and also in the United States. And look what they have achieved as well.
Yes, well, unfortunately, the United States is sort of going down a more extreme path than us. And I think it's, we've seen over the last 50 years more than 1 million a year immigrants, non-European immigrants into the United States, and I fear they won't be able to maintain their standards of living in the long term. Just a view. Yes, Sam. Sam.
Can I very quickly come back and ask you something? There are 1,843 mosques in this country.
Yes.
961 of them owe allegiance to imams and caliphs and others who want to destroy white civilization, or at least non-Islamic civilization. We've just seen, of course, what happened to poor David Ames, who started in the Monday Club when I was chairman of it years ago. If this country does not wake up, and I know you're a person who could stir them up, if the country does not wake up in 40 years' time, less than that, 25 years' time, we could be in ruin. Do you have any practical suggestions that we could all play our part in seeking to reverse that possible trend?
Well, there's always your useless members of parliament that you can write to, because if you don't write to them, they say, we've had no complaints. Nobody writes to us about it. I mean, not like Enoch Powell, who had a truck delivering his mail bags. I think that the only way forward is to ask aliens, particularly Muslim aliens, who are so completely alien to us and our way of life, to give them a time scale to leave. And, if you don't do that, then you're accepting that they're staying. And so you're going to accept an increase in your mosques. So I think, a government has to bite the bullet eventually. Because, in France, there was a letter published in the newspapers signed by nearly 100 members of the military, officers, high-level officers, generals and so on, saying, we can't go on like this, there'll be a civil war. I'm not saying that's going to happen here, but I think you've got to decide whether you're going to allow mass immigration. The government's doing nothing about immigration, nothing. And unless we do something, then it's all going to go down the toilet. I mean, these people bring nothing to us. They bring nothing to us. People in the third world, they come here with nothing for us. There's nothing they can offer us. We did it all. And, sometimes somebody puts their hand up and says, oh, what about algebra? Okay. So you've got one thing, or maybe two things or three things, not 300,000 things or 3 million things. And that's the problem. That is the problem. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to ask, in your view, why do you think the Long March wasn't stopped?
Sorry?
In your view, why do you think the Long March through the institutions wasn't stopped? How was it so seamlessly?
Well, some of us supported the Conservative Party for decades, before we realized they weren't conservative at all. And then we found that they had marched right through the institutions, including the church, including our national church. And everywhere you look, the institutions, look at all these people going on about Rhodes' statue. When I was at Oxford, Rhodes was considered a great hero. He was considered a great British hero, a great British man. And now, these people want to take the statue down, or at least they want to put a net over it or something. I mean, it's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. At Worcester College, not so very long ago, about 6-7 months ago, they took a vote to remove the portrait of the Queen. This is what is going on. And the reason it's going on is because the students are today left. They go to schools. The left have taken over the educational institutions. We saw that when they hounded out Sir Roger Scruton from his professorship with London University. And he had to go to America to get employment, because nobody would employ him here, because he wrote a book about conservatism. Just imagine that. And now it's impossible to get get jobs. Look at Frank Ellis. He stood up in some lecture and said, "It is my opinion, based on medical fact, that Negroes don't have the same IQ as us." Sacked. Yeah? Sacked. Despite sort of truckloads of books written by endless scientists. Doesn't matter. These people have taken over the education system. They're churning out left-wing students. And that's why we're in such a terrible, terrible state. I don't know the answer. I don't know how we're going to turn it round. But we have to keep making people aware of what is happening, in the hope that bit by bit people will take up the cudgels and say, we're going to try and do something. Even if they don't succeed, trying is good.
I personally suggest a lot of these things are part of a wider ideological framework that could be summarized by people like Derrida, Foucault, about deconstructing the West and taking apart everything that is and that we know. And part of it's not just one thing like immigration, mass immigration, flooding of people. There's a multi-pronged attack on a lot of different fronts, and we need to address that ideological framework and have the power to get messages out there, like an arm in the mass media.
Well, I think we do have the power to get the message out there, and that is one of the great values of the internet. We're able to get out there. We have on our Facebook channels, we've had up to 3 million people. When I was in the Conservative Monday Club, we used to think we'd made a great success by publishing 5,000 booklets, you know, and now you can reach millions. And that's possibly the way forward. People are getting fed up. You only have to speak to people, but people are afraid. They're afraid to say anything for the very reasons that I spelt out. Yeah. 1 minute, Michelle. Yes?
The solution not lie in having a new warrior class.
Sorry?
Because I feel like the politicians and intellectuals aren't going to save us. We need a new generation of men of gold, who don't rust. We need a new warrior class. Instead of standing around and talking all the time, we need to develop systems and businesses that benefit us. That's what we need.
Well, there you are, you're young, you go for it. I think that it's a very difficult question, and I don't know how it's going to end unless we get a political party that is going to have the nerve and the gumption to stand up and say, well, all these people who are totally alien to us, their holiday is over and they must go home. And if they don't go home by the end of a 5-year period, we will forcibly remove them. I'm of the opinion that 99% would go within that period. But you've got to have a government. We're talking about the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party did not oppose the march through the institutions. They've never opposed the left. In fact, they have supported the left. And now anyone looking at conservative agendas, especially their social agenda, can't see any difference between a Marxist and a conservative. All this nonsense about LBGT and allowing parents to choose their child's identity, I mean, it's a disgrace. And there are just so many things wrong that they have done, all of which are just blatantly supporting the socialists. So it's all going to end in tears unless there's something coming over the horizon that I haven't seen. So, is that it? Are we done? Yeah, Michelle, last question.
Well, it's not so much a question, of course, it's the answer. And I've heard recently from a German professor called modified sex plan because it's already out there. It just needs to be known about, and this is a wonderful group for doing just that.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break for lunch.